Hi, and welcome to You Can't Spell Functions Without Fun, Part 2. We have quite a number of objectives to get through this, and so there's going to be a couple of parts to this lecture so that we don't get tired and oh my God, halfway through, is this ever going to end? Although you might feel that way anyway. So let's go ahead and get through this here. The first one is we're going to describe the concepts of functions. What are functions and why do we need them? Then we're going to learn how to define and call a function because we've been calling functions for a while, though we haven't necessarily said that outright. And then we're going to look at how to use functions to design a program. Then we're going to look at the call stack, which is how functions stack up on top of each other every time we call them. And then we're also going to talk about local variables only for that function itself and nowhere else. Regarding variables, we're going to talk about global variables as well and how bad they are. It doesn't say that here, but it's on the slide and it's true. And then we're going to use a special variable named name, __ name. This is also called dunder name, dunder name, to run your code without global variables because, again, global variables are bad. So this is where we're going over the many parts of this lecture. Let's get cracking. First up, we're going to talk about functions. Just everything there. Lots of things to know about functions. So the problem that we're trying to solve with functions is our code can end up having lots of lines. And this isn't really a lot of lines. This is this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 lines of code here, but Python files can be hundreds of lines long for anything really meaningful. And so because of that, what we end up doing is we end up usually putting comments in here to describe what the next block of code is going to do. So this one says, should we continue? And it gets an answer from the person, add 2 numbers, yes or no. And if the answer is n, then we break out of this loop here and the program ends. And then we have another block here that says get and add numbers, then print the total. And that's what these 4 lines of code do. When it gets really complex, imagine hundreds of lines of this with comments describing what things happen and then reading this. Problems can show up. So for example, what happens if we come back in here? Because here's the deal. We're doing these assignments and it's just you write the code once and you send it to me and that's it. But what happens if you're actually writing a real program or a script that you're going to use over and over and you're going to develop as you go along? Because of that, you'll be coming back in and adding more lines in here and changing the functionality and being like, I don't want this one. I want something else in there. Sometimes these comments can not actually describe what's going on, or maybe sometimes you come back in here and you're like, I don't really remember what this means, even though I have a comment here. So there has to be a better way for us to organize our code in a way such that we can help break up our program and make it easier to understand. Because that's really what functions are about. They're a code organization tool for humans to use to better understand their code. Just to give you an example, here is a little utility that I wrote to manage some SSH keys on my computer. It doesn't matter what they are, but this is me wanting a way to more easily handle files on my computer. And you'll notice in here, I didn't put any comments. What the crap is going on here, Curtis? And so I've got lines here here's a block of code. And because I've put spaces in between that block and other things, this block must do something. What does it do? I don't know. There's no comments here. And so what I have to do as a programmer, if I wanted to understand this code, come back in and do something else, I have to read it line by line and figure out what the frack is going on. And then once I have that, I have to come here and look at this block of code and try to figure out what that is. Then I have to look at this block of code and have to figure out what that is and just keep going. And you'll see here that this little utility all it does is it provides a way for me to be able to manage some files on my computer. This little utility is over 100 lines long. And so this is why we want to have a better way to organize our code in such a way that dummies like me who just wrote all this crap out was like, I don't need no comments. Man, I need some comments. Because if I came back in here, let's see, the last time I touched this file was over a year ago. And so I'm going to have to like go in there. I've forgotten really what the details are. So I'm going to have to go in there and try to figure out what those lines of code mean if I want to change my cool little keys utility. So this is how one way that functions can help us, okay? So let's get on with that. So we're gonna just jump right into functions. Let's look at this part of code here, which gets and adds the numbers, then prints the total, okay? 4 lines of code. Rather than using a comment to tell us what this does, we can take these 4 lines of code here and put them into a function. And we're going to figure out what a function is and how to use it and how to define it. I just want you to see what it looks like. This function here, get and add numbers, print total, which is almost exactly what the comment said, is an executable block of code. So this thing here is like a variable, but instead of storing values, it stores code. And we can use that variable to run this code. So let's jump into that and see what that looks like. So what we end up doing is we take these 4 lines of code here and we put them into a function. We rewrite our code. We rewrite this code. Over here on the right-hand side, we put those 4 lines of code here and they're indented. Notice that they're indented. Because they're indented, they're part of the def, part of the definition. This means function definition here. So we're defining a function named get and add numbers, print total, and it has 4 lines of code stored in it. Left, right, total, and print. Okay, it does those 4 lines. And then down here in our true, instead of having these 4 lines of code, we replace it with a function call. Replace it here. Get and add numbers, print total, this. And we have to use these parentheses here to call the function. So what we have here is a variable named get and add numbers, print total. Instead of having a value in it, it's got code stored in it. And when we write that function name with the parentheses, it's very important, with these parentheses, what it does is it says, I want you to run that code. And so you can see here that these 4 lines of code that are stored inside this variable, when we call this, it's like we jump up here and actually run them. And we'll actually see that here in a couple of minutes. So how does this work? And it's really important that you understand this first paragraph. When Python is reading your code and it sees this def keyword, it says define. Okay, I'm going to define a function. It creates that variable, and then it reads the lines but does not evaluate them. These are not evaluated. They're just stored inside the variable. No print statement is going to happen. No input is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen until we actually call that function. Once we call the function, that's when these lines of code will run. Let's take a look at this in our code editor and see how that happens. Here we have a print statement, print hello, and then a function definition called print junk, and it prints 3 junky lines, and then we have print goodbye. When I run this code, what's going to happen? Think about it for a minute. Okay, now I'm going to run the code. All it does is print hello and goodbye. And the reason for that is Python got to this def keyword here, said, okay, I'm going to define a function. It creates a variable named print junk, and then takes these 3 lines of code and puts it inside that variable. I've never used that function. I've never called it anywhere. And so right now, these 3 lines are stored inside this variable, just waiting to run, but they're not running. They're just sitting there. So I've got print hello. That's code by itself, so it ends up printing hello. And I've got goodbye, which ends up printing goodbye, but nothing else happens here. So how do I actually make these 3 lines of code run? I actually call that function, print junk. I use the variable name, the function name, and then I use the parentheses to run that function. Okay, so once I put the parentheses here, Python's going to be like, oh, Curtis wants to take this function and run the code inside it. Boop, beep, boop, beep, boo, like that, okay? So now I run it. Let me clear that out. Now I run it. And you can see right here, hello, goodbye. So what it's done, when it got to this line here, print junk, it's like, oh, Curtis wants to run those lines of code. So it jumps back to the first line of this function, runs these in order, 1, 2, 3, and then when it's done, it jumps back to the next line in my function or in my code. Functions are really cool this way in that you can package up lines of code and then run them wherever you want in your program. A common mistake we make is writing print junk without the parentheses. What do you think is going to happen here? If you say nothing, that's correct. I'm going to run this now. Boop, like this. And you can see it just runs hello and goodbye. That's because we didn't put the parentheses at the end. This is a common mistake. We accidentally just type the function name, but we don't put the parentheses on it. Once we do that, it's actually going to run. So now let's actually step through the code. I'm going to run through my debugger here, and I'm going to step through the code and show you a new way that we need to be able to step through our code. Okay, so remember, in previous ones, I used stepped over. I'm going to need step into, which is this next one here. So I'm going to click step into. So I'm going to click step over. And so that goes to print hello. Now what happens here? If I click step next, now print, it just skipped all 3 of these lines. And if I look inside my variables here, if I look inside the variables that are currently in here, inside my function variables, you can see there is a function named print junk. It is a variable named print junk, and it's pointing to some function here. It's function, and if you look here, you can see that it pops up this thing here, function print junk at some memory address. So those lines of code are now stored inside the memory here. Now, if I actually want to run those, print junk like this, I can click step into, and that means step into the function. So watch where my execution line, the yellow line, watch where it goes. Step into. You see that? So it went from here all the way up to here. And now it's running this line of code. And so I click step into, step in. Now that it's at this line of the code, it's going to jump back to where it left off. So it's going to jump back to here because functions can also return values. So it might have a return value. This function doesn't, but we're going to talk about return values really soon here. So this function may have a return value. So it's going to come back to here and say, if I have a return value, I'll put it into a variable if you have one. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. And so that's what we're going to see here. I'm going to step, and you can see I'm back here at print junk. And if I look inside my stack, I have to clear out this here. If I look inside my stack here, we can see that there is a return value for print junk, and that return value is none. None is a special value in Python, which means there is no value. It's none. So we have things like strings, and they can be any text, and booleans, which can be true or false, and numbers, which can be any number. There is a none type, and it has one value, none. None. So now we're here, and this is returning the value none. If we wanted to print that out, it would then print none. If we wanted to assign it to a variable, the variable would then be set to none. None is like saying there is no value here. So now that we have that done, if we just keep stepping, now we're at goodbye, and we step again, and it's all done. And it prints goodbye right here. So that's how it affected this line of code. So with if statements, if we had if something, it runs the lines that are indented to that if. You see that? And then if we had a for loop, then it runs the lines that are indented to the for loop. Functions are different in that it stores the code inside the variable. And then when we call that with parentheses after the function name, it doesn't just keep going down after it to the indented lines. Instead, it jumps back to the first indented line of that function. And once it's done at the end of the function, it comes back here and returns whatever value we tell it to return, and then continues. It's like we can go back we go back up to wherever our function is. So in this case here, it takes all of this code and puts it inside get and add numbers print total, okay? Then we are at the while true. We say, do you want to add 2 numbers? And they say yes. So now answer is the string y. If we have y is equal to n, that's not true. So this is not going to run. And we're just going to go to the next line of code. Get and add numbers print total because we're invoking that function, control, the place the next line that gets executed. Python jumps back to this line here and says, I'm going to run this line of code. So then it shows first number, and then it gets the second number. It adds them together. It prints the total. And then when that's done, it comes back and it says, I'm going to return, because there's no return value here, I'm going to return none, and then I'm going to keep going. And keeping going here means I'm at the end of my while loop, which means I come back to the while loop, and the while loop is true. So now it's going to run this again. Would you like to add 2 numbers? And so we just keep looping until somebody types in n, and every time we loop, we get to this get and add numbers total with the parentheses, and that makes our code go back up here. Python runs these, and then it comes back down here and then loops again, okay? That's how functions work. So the anatomy of a simple function, I know I'm harping on this a lot, but we're doing it over and over so that it like really sinks in. The first thing we do is the keyword def. So def means we are defining a function. Then we give it the name of the function. Whatever we do, mine is snake case and it's really long. Normally our functions don't have this really long name, but this does get and add numbers and it prints the total. So it describes what that function does. Then we have parentheses to tell it it's a function, and then we have a colon at the end. Remember, whenever we have a colon in Python, that gives us the opportunity to have indented lines, and the indented lines belong to whatever the thing the colon has. So in this case, we have 4 indented lines after this colon here, and those 4 indented lines all belong to the def. They belong to this function here. So that's what a simple function looks like. We're going to get a little more sophisticated later on. So the next thing is we may want to, let's take this a little further. So we had more lines of code here. We just took those lines, moved them into a function, and then we just called the function. And we're like, does this work? So let's sort of see what's going to happen here, one step by step, okay? So we get to this def here, Python gets to this def, and it takes these lines of code and stores them inside that variable, that function. It gets to these lines of code and then stores them inside that variable because it's a def. Okay, so now we have 2 functions, get and add numbers print total and person wants to quit. Then we get to this while loop. That's something that Python can run and says while true, great. So I'm going to go to person wants to quit. It's got the parentheses here, so I'm going to run it. And what it ends up doing, let me erase this stuff here because we've already executed that in our brains. It comes up here and it says answer, add 2 numbers, y or n. Let's say somebody puts in n. They put in the string n. Now that gets assigned to the answer variable, and now answer is the lowercase n. Here it says if n is equal to n. That's true, so its lines of code are going to run. This line says break. Okay, and this is where the problem is. This is where we get our error. What is this breaking? Well, you could say it's breaking this while loop down here, but breaks inside a function like this, they don't know about this while loop over here. They're like, I'm trying to break out of a loop inside this function. There is no loop inside this function. So we would get to this line and Python would throw a syntax error. It'd be like, I don't know what's going on. Break what? I break me. That's what it would say. And then it would crash. So we can't move breaks outside of our while loops or our for loops or any kind of loops. Our breaks still have to be inside that thing. So the question is there no way to do this? And the answer is, of course there's a way to do this. There's always a way to do almost everything in programming. So this is what we can do. The person wants to quit can return a value, a Boolean value, true or false. And if person wants to quit, if that function is true, then we'll quit. And if it's false, we'll keep going. So now we have this definition of person wants to quit. It gets the input. And then we say answer is equal to n. So is the answer equal to n? And that's the value we're going to return. And that's going to either be true or false, depending on what the person typed in. And then it gets down here and it says, if person wants to quit. Okay, so let's take a look and see how this runs. So this function gets created, this function gets created, those lines get stored inside these variables, these function names. Then we get to the while true, and then we get to this if statement. Okay, so just like with the assignment operator, if needs a value. So what is this value? The value is whatever this function returns. We are calling a function here. So when we do that, it comes up here and it says, what's your answer, person? And then the person types something in. So let's say they type in y. So at this point, answer is equal to y. Is y equal to n? The answer is no. So answer is n is false, and we end up returning false. And so now this false value that gets returned, that's the value that comes back here and is given to the if statement. The if statement says, if person wants to quit comes up here and says false and returns that. So that then becomes if false. And so because it's false, we don't break and we just go and add our numbers. What happens on the next loop? Because once we're done here, it's going to come back to the while true. True's like, okay, let's keep going. I'm a while loop. Let's keep going. Then it says, if person wants to quit, parentheses. At this point, it comes up here and it says, hey, answer, or hey, you, do you want to add two numbers, y or n? We type in the letter n, and that value gets stored in answer. And now we have the lowercase n is equal to n, and that's true. So the answer is n becomes true. And then we return true from our function. So true comes down here and replaces this. So now it's if true. And because it's if true, then we break. And this breaks out of that while loop. And it's like, I'm going to the end. Nothing left for me. I'm done. Woo! Yay! We've already seen functions that return values. We've seen it with input. Input here returns a string. So when we call this function, somewhere inside that function is a return statement, and that return statement returns a string, and that's the value that gets put into answer. We've seen it with the str function, which takes any value and returns a string. We've seen it with int, which returns any integer from some value, and we have float. So for example, here, float. So we've got input. This thing here calls a function. That goes off to some function somewhere named input that's built into Python. That runs and then returns some sort of string, 1.72. So this value ends up getting returned and replacing, essentially. It gets sent, it gets returned, and when it gets returned to the float function. And now we have float and that string 1.72. And what does float do? Float takes this value, does some stuff with it, and then returns the number 1.72. And so this value is the value that's returned by float, and that's the value that gets stored inside left. So this is all about, this is functions. Since we can't have a break, since we can't put the break inside this function for this while loop, instead, we change our code for our function to say, I'm going to give you a true or false answer, and you can use that in your if statement. And now this reads a lot better. If person wants to quit, and let's say we want to change the way somebody wants to quit. They don't type in Y or N, they type in 0 or 1 or some crap like that. We come to this function and change it, but it still means person wants to quit. That's why functions are cool. The name of the function describes what the function does, and in this case, what the value is that it's going to return. All right, we've been going for a while, so let's take a break. Whoo!